In the heart of Georgia's fertile countryside, where cotton fields stretched as far as the eye could see, lived a third-generation farmer who had transformed his grandfather's modest plot into a thriving agricultural empire. At 45, Thomas Richardson Jr. had achieved what many considered impossible, building a multi-million-dollar farming operation from the ground up, despite the countless obstacles that came his way. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as Thomas walked through his vast fields, his calloused hands touching the cotton bolls that would soon be ready for harvest. His success story had become legendary in the farming community, but few knew the real struggles he had faced to get where he was today. Starting with just 100 acres inherited from his grandfather, he had expanded his operation to over 5,000 acres, making him one of the largest independent farmers in the Southeast. His days typically began before sunrise, overseeing a workforce of 50 employees, managing sophisticated farming equipment, and making crucial decisions that would affect not just his business but the entire community that depended on it. Thomas had always believed in reinvesting in his operation, constantly upgrading his equipment and implementing the latest agricultural technologies. The decision to purchase a private jet hadn't come lightly. With farms spread across 3 states and frequent meetings with major agricultural corporations, the need for efficient transportation had become crucial. His old pickup truck and occasional commercial flights weren't cutting it anymore. The jet would save precious time and allow him to manage his expanding empire more effectively. What Thomas didn't expect was the reaction he'd receive when he walked into Southern Aviation Dealers that morning. The prestigious dealership's glass doors reflected the bright Georgia sun as he approached, dressed in his usual attire, a clean but well-worn plaid shirt, comfortable jeans, and his trusted work boots. He had called ahead to schedule an appointment to view their selection of light business jets. The receptionist's smile froze when she saw him enter. Her eyes darted to the security guard stationed near the entrance, a subtle gesture that Thomas had grown unfortunately familiar with over the years. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone carrying that hint of doubt he'd heard countless times before. "Yes, I have an appointment to view your Cessna Citation CJ4, Thomas replied calmly, having learned long ago that maintaining his dignity was more important than reacting to others' prejudices. The name's Thomas Richardson Jr. The atmosphere in the dealership shifted palpably as the receptionist verified his appointment. Other customers and salespeople tried to mask their surprise, but their sideways glances spoke volumes. Thomas had faced similar situations throughout his life, at banks, at equipment dealers, and even at agricultural conferences. Each time, he let his success speak louder than any prejudice. A young salesman eventually approached, introducing himself with visible uncertainty. "Mr. Richardson? I'm David Cooper. I understand you're interested in our Citation CJ4. The skepticism in his voice was barely concealed, a familiar note that Thomas had heard countless times before. As Thomas began discussing the aircraft specifications, pulling up his company's financial records on his tablet, the salesman's demeanor gradually shifted. The numbers spoke for themselves: the Richardson Farming Corporation's annual revenue, its growth trajectory, and its impeccable credit history told a story that transcended any preconceived notions. What happened next would become a story that would circulate through the aviation industry for years to come. But more importantly, it would serve as a powerful reminder that success knows no color, and assumptions often reveal more about the assumers than their subjects. The story of how Thomas Richardson Jr. walked into that dealership wasn't just about buying a jet, it was about challenging perceptions, breaking barriers, and proving that determination, hard work, and dignity could overcome even the most deeply rooted prejudices. As the sun set over his vast cotton fields that evening, Thomas knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was ready to face them, just as he had faced every obstacle in his path to success. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of a series of events that would not only transform Thomas's life but also impact an entire industry's perspective on prejudice and success. The real story was about to unfold, and its ripple effects would reach far beyond the walls of that aviation dealership in Georgia. As Thomas sat in the dealership's pristine conference room, the atmosphere began to shift dramatically. The young salesman, David Cooper, had just finished reviewing Richardson Farming Corporation's financials, and the initial skepticism in his eyes had been replaced by something else, respect, mixed with a hint of embarrassment. "Mr. Richardson," David cleared his throat, straightening his tie, "I apologize for any misconceptions earlier. Your company's financial standing is exceptional. Would you like to see the aircraft now?" Thomas nodded, his face maintaining the same composed expression he'd worn since walking through the doors. As they walked across the sunlit hangar, their footsteps echoing off the polished concrete floor, the $9 million Cessna Citation CJ-4 came into view. Its sleek white fuselage gleamed under the industrial lights, a testament to modern engineering and luxury. What happened next would become legendary in the aviation industry. As David began his standard presentation about the jet's features, Thomas interrupted him with a detailed question about the aircraft's thrust-to-weight ratio and its performance on shorter runways, the kind he'd had built on his largest farm last year. The salesman's jaw dropped slightly. "You're a pilot?" "Licensed for both fixed-wing and rotary aircraft," Thomas replied, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Been flying crop dusters since I was 20. Got my commercial license 5 years ago." He ran his hand along the aircraft's smooth exterior, examining the winglets with an expert's eye. Word of Thomas's expertise quickly spread through the dealership. Soon, the sales manager appeared, followed by the owner himself, Richard Wellington, a silver-haired veteran of the aviation industry. The dynamic in the hangar shifted yet again as Thomas engaged them in a detailed discussion about fuel efficiency, maintenance schedules, and avionics systems. "Mr. Richardson," Wellington said, his tone notably different from the cold atmosphere that had greeted Thomas earlier, "I understand you're interested in our CJ-4. But given your operational needs, might I suggest you also consider the Citation XLS Plus? It offers additional cargo capacity that could be beneficial for your multi-state operations." For the next 2 hours, Thomas was treated to a comprehensive tour of various aircraft models. The same employees who had earlier cast suspicious glances now listened intently as he discussed the intricacies of agricultural empire management and the role of aviation in modern farming. During a break in the discussions, Thomas stepped outside to take a call from his operations manager about the upcoming harvest. Standing there in his work boots and plaid shirt, he could see his reflection in the dealership's tinted windows, a successful businessman, a skilled pilot, and a farmer who had never let others' prejudices define his path. When he returned, Wellington had prepared a detailed proposal for not one, but 2 aircraft, the CJ-4 and a slightly used XLS Plus. The deal he offered was competitive, clearly aimed at establishing a long-term relationship with Richardson Farming Corporation. "Mr. Richardson," Wellington said, leaning forward in his chair, "I want to be direct with you. We've been in this business for 30 years, and I've never met someone with your unique combination of agricultural expertise and aviation knowledge. We'd be honored to have you as a client." Thomas listened carefully, noting how the word "honored" seemed to stick in Wellington's throat, a man clearly unused to expressing such sentiments to someone he had initially underestimated. The proposal before him was excellent, but Thomas had learned long ago that every negotiation was about more than just the immediate deal. "Mr. Wellington," he replied, his voice steady and clear, "I appreciate your offer. But before we proceed, I'd like to discuss something else, your company's diversity initiatives and community outreach programs." The silence that followed was profound. Wellington shifted in his seat, while David, who had remained in the room, looked down at his notebook. Thomas continued, "I believe we have an opportunity here to do more than just business. My success story isn't as unique as you might think. There are many talented individuals out there who just need the right opportunities." What followed was a conversation that would reshape Southern aviation dealers' corporate culture. Thomas shared stories of other successful black farmers, pilots, and entrepreneurs who had faced similar prejudices. He spoke about the importance of first impressions, equal treatment, and the cost of lost opportunities due to bias. By the end of the day, Thomas had not only negotiated an excellent deal on both aircraft but had also secured a commitment from Wellington to establish an internship program for minority youth interested in aviation. The program would provide flight training, maintenance education, and business aviation exposure to students from underserved communities. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hangar floor, Thomas signed the final paperwork for his aircraft purchases. The dealership had transformed from a place of cold stares and suspicion to one of respect and new possibilities. But Thomas knew this was just one small victory in a much larger battle. Walking to his truck, he reflected on how this day would impact not just his business but potentially the lives of countless others. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, a recent agricultural science graduate who helped manage their northern operations. "How did it go, Dad?" Thomas smiled as he typed his reply, "Change doesn't always come easy, baby girl. But sometimes, all it takes is one person to open the door for others to follow." He looked back at the dealership, where Wellington was still standing in the doorway, perhaps seeing his own business, and the world, in a slightly different light. The story of Thomas Richardson Jr.'s visit to Southern aviation dealers would soon spread throughout the industry, but its real impact would be felt in the years to come, as new faces began to appear in hangars, cockpits, and boardrooms across the country. Sometimes, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of courage and dignity. News travels fast in the agriculture and aviation industries, and within weeks of Thomas's visit to Southern aviation dealers, the story had spread like wildfire. What made it particularly compelling wasn't just the purchase of 2 private jets, it was the way Thomas had transformed a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for lasting change. One crisp morning, as Thomas prepared for his first official flight in the new Citation CJ-4, he received an unexpected call. The caller was Robert Chen, publisher of Agricultural Aviation Quarterly, requesting an interview. The magazine wanted to feature Thomas's journey from crop duster to agricultural empire builder, focusing on his innovative approach to modern farming and aviation. "Your story needs to be told," Robert insisted, his voice eager over the speakerphone as Thomas walked through his pre-flight checklist. "You're breaking down barriers in both agriculture and aviation. That's unprecedented." Thomas paused, his hand resting on the aircraft's gleaming control panel. He'd never sought the spotlight, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But he also understood the power of visibility, how seeing someone who looks like you succeed can inspire others to dream bigger. That same afternoon, after completing a smooth flight to check on his operations in Tennessee, Thomas received another surprising call. This time, it was from Dr. Patricia Thompson, Dean of the State Agricultural University's aviation program. She had heard about the internship program he'd initiated at Southern aviation dealers and wanted to discuss expanding it into a comprehensive scholarship program. "Mr. Richardson," she explained, her voice filled with enthusiasm, "we have so many talented students who dream of combining agriculture and aviation, but lack the resources and connections to make it happen. Your story is exactly what they need to hear." As Thomas drove across his Tennessee farmland, inspecting the latest GPS-guided irrigation systems he'd installed, he reflected on his own journey. He remembered the countless doors that had been closed in his face, the loan applications that were mysteriously denied, the suspicious glances at agricultural conferences. But he also remembered those who had helped him along the way, his grandfather's wisdom, his father's determination, and the few industry veterans who had seen past the color of his skin to recognize his potential. Back at his main office in Georgia, Thomas's daughter Alexis was already working on implementing the internship program. A stack of applications sat on her desk, young people from various backgrounds, all eager for an opportunity to learn about agricultural aviation. "Dad," she said during their evening video call, her face glowing with excitement, "you should see these applications. There's a young woman here who's been crop dusting since she was 16, helping on her family's small farm. And a boy who built his own drone monitoring system for their orchards. They just need a chance." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The story had caught the attention of major agricultural corporations, leading to new contract opportunities for Richardson Farming Corporation. But Thomas remained focused on what mattered most, using his success to create opportunities for others. He scheduled meetings with other black farmers who had succeeded despite the odds, forming an informal network of mentors and advisors. Together, they began developing programs to support the next generation of agricultural entrepreneurs, sharing knowledge about everything from soil management to financial planning. The impact of Thomas's actions began to ripple through the industry. Other aviation dealers started reviewing their diversity policies. Agricultural banks reached out to discuss special financing programs for minority farmers. Even the old guard farming associations began to change, slowly opening their doors to new perspectives and voices. One particular moment stood out. During a major agricultural aviation conference, Thomas was invited to give a keynote speech. Standing at the podium, looking out over a sea of faces, many of whom had probably never expected to see someone like him in that position, he shared his vision of an industry where talent and determination mattered more than appearance. Success in agriculture and aviation requires the same things, he told the audience, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Precision. Patience. Persistence. And most importantly, the courage to keep going when others say you can't. The response was overwhelming. After his speech, a line of young people formed, each wanting to share their dreams and challenges. Thomas listened to each one, remembering his own journey and the importance of having someone believe in you. Later that evening, as Thomas piloted his citation back home, he thought about how his grandfather would view all this. The old man had farmed with mules and hand tools, dreaming of a day when his family would own not just the land, but the means to make it truly prosper. Now, his grandson was flying between farms in a private jet, opening doors for others to follow. The sun was setting as Thomas landed at his private airstrip, casting long shadows across the fields his family had worked for generations. His phone buzzed with a message from Richard Wellington at Southern Aviation Dealers. The first group of interns had completed their orientation. Attached was a photo of 5 young faces, beaming with pride in front of a training aircraft. Walking from the hangar to his office, Thomas passed the wall where he'd hung his grandfather's old tools, a reminder of where he'd come from and the responsibility that came with success. On his desk was the latest issue of Agricultural Aviation Quarterly, featuring his story on the cover. But what caught his eye was the stack of letters from young farmers and aspiring pilots, each one hoping to follow in his footsteps. That night, as Thomas reviewed plans for expanding his operations into new states, he realized that his greatest legacy wouldn't be the size of his farms or the aircraft he owned. It would be the doors he'd opened, the lives he'd touched, and the changes he'd helped set in motion. In breaking down barriers in both agriculture and aviation, he wasn't just building a business, he was helping to build a future where success truly knew no boundaries. 6 months after Thomas Richardson Jr.'s memorable visit to Southern Aviation Dealers, the autumn harvest was in full swing. The drone of his new Citation CJ-4 had become a familiar sound across his expanding network of farms, but today's flight was different. In the cabin behind him sat the first graduating class of the aviation internship program, 5 young people who represented everything he'd been fighting for. Among them was DeAndre Washington, a 22-year-old from a small family farm in Mississippi. Like Thomas years ago, DeAndre had learned to fly by piloting crop dusters, dreaming of bigger skies while working his family's modest acreage. Now, with his newly earned commercial pilot's license, he was preparing to help manage aerial operations for several black-owned farms in the region. "Mr. Richardson," DeAndre called from the cabin as they cruised at 35,000 feet, "how did you know this would work?" "Starting the program, I mean. There were so many people who said it couldn't be done." Thomas smiled, remembering his own doubts and challenges. Through the cockpit window, he could see the patchwork of farmland below, a canvas of browns and greens that told the story of American agriculture. "Sometimes," he replied, "you have to be the change you want to see." But you can't do it alone. The truth was, the past 6 months had been transformative not just for the interns, but for the entire industry. The partnership between Richardson Farming Corporation and Southern Aviation Dealers had evolved into something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. Richard Wellington, initially skeptical about the internship program, had become one of its strongest advocates. After seeing the success of the first class, he'd reached out to other aviation dealers across the country, creating a network of training opportunities for minority youth interested in agricultural aviation. But success hadn't come without challenges. Some old guard members of the agricultural community had resisted the changes, claiming that Thomas was stirring up trouble or playing the race card. These critics fell silent, however, when the numbers spoke for themselves. Farms participating in the program reported increased efficiency and profitability thanks to the innovative approaches brought by the young aviators. Landing at his Tennessee operation, Thomas led his group on a tour of the latest addition to his agricultural empire, a state-of-the-art processing facility that combined traditional farming wisdom with cutting-edge technology. The facility employed over 100 local workers and had become a model for sustainable agricultural practices. "This is what's possible when we break down barriers," Thomas explained to his young protégés as they walked through rows of advanced sorting machinery. "It's not just about flying planes or growing crops. It's about creating opportunities that lift entire communities." That evening, during a dinner celebrating the intern's graduation, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. James Parker, one of his strongest critics and owner of a rival farming operation, had come to see the facility for himself. The tension in the room was palpable as the two men faced each other. "I owe you an apology, Thomas," James said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "I was wrong about your program. Wrong about a lot of things, actually. Seeing what you've built here, what these young people have achieved, it's opened my eyes." The moment was powerful not just for its unexpectedness, but for what it represented. Change was happening, not through confrontation or force, but through example and excellence. Later that night, after the celebrations had ended, Thomas sat in his office reviewing applications for the next class of interns. The stack was 3 times larger than the previous year, including candidates from all backgrounds and corners of the country. Each application told a story of determination, of dreams that needed only an opportunity to flourish. His daughter Alexis joined him, bringing coffee and her usual sharp insights. "Dad, we need to think bigger," she said, spreading out plans for an expanded training facility. "The demand is there. We could double the program next year, maybe even triple it." Thomas leaned back in his chair, looking at the photos on his wall, his grandfather with his mule-drawn plow, his father standing proud in their first mechanized harvester, and now his own aircraft fleet parked alongside modern farming equipment. Each generation had pushed the boundaries of what was possible, not just for themselves but for others. "You know what your grandfather used to say?" Thomas asked, turning to Alexis. "He'd say, the soil doesn't care who tends it, as long as they tend it with respect. Same goes for the sky. These young people, they've got the talent, the drive. They just need someone to believe in them." The next morning, Thomas took off before dawn in the Citation, this time heading to Washington, D.C. He'd been invited to testify before a congressional committee on agricultural innovation and opportunities for minority farmers. As the sun rose over the Appalachian Mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape below, he reflected on how far things had come from that day in the aviation dealership. His phone buzzed with a message from DeAndre. The young pilot had just completed his first solo flight in a crop duster, helping a small family farm in Alabama protect their cotton crop from pests. Attached was a photo of DeAndre standing proudly next to the aircraft, his face beaming with the same joy Thomas had felt on his first solo flight years ago. In the nation's capital, Thomas would share not just his own story, but the stories of all those who had become part of this growing movement. He would talk about DeAndre, about the other graduates, about James Parker's change of heart, and about the countless others who were proving that talent and determination knew no boundaries. The citation cruised smoothly through the morning sky, its shadow racing across the farms below. Thomas thought about how his simple decision to buy a jet had sparked a chain reaction that was still unfolding. It wasn't just about breaking barriers in aviation or agriculture anymore, it was about showing future generations that they could soar as high as their dreams would take them. The marble halls of Congress felt a world away from the fertile fields of Georgia, but Thomas Richardson Jr. stood tall as he prepared to address the Agricultural Innovation Committee. The hearing room was packed with legislators, industry leaders, and media representatives, all eager to hear from the farmer who had become a symbol of change in American agriculture. Distinguished members of the committee, Thomas began, his voice steady and clear, "I stand before you not just as a farmer or a businessman, but as someone who has seen firsthand both the challenges and possibilities in American agriculture. The story I'm about to share isn't just mine, it belongs to countless others who dream of making their mark in this industry." As Thomas spoke, he could see the faces in the room changing, moving from polite interest to genuine engagement. He shared stories of young people like DeAndre, of skeptics turned supporters like James Parker, and of the transformative power of opportunity when barriers are removed. The future of American agriculture, he continued, lies not just in our soil and technology, but in our ability to tap into all of our nation's talent. Every time we let prejudice close a door, we're not just hurting individuals, we're hurting our entire agricultural sector. The questions from committee members came rapidly, but Thomas was prepared. When asked about the costs of his internship program, he responded with data showing the return on investment, increased efficiency, innovative solutions, and the creation of new jobs in rural communities. One senior senator leaned forward, clearly skeptical. "Mr. Richardson, while your success is admirable, isn't this more about social engineering than agriculture?" The room fell silent. Thomas took a moment, remembering all the times he'd faced similar dismissals of his efforts. "Senator," he replied, "there's nothing engineered about talent. What we're doing is simply removing the artificial barriers that have kept that talent from flourishing. The results speak for themselves." He proceeded to share the latest data from his operations: crop yields 30% above industry average, revolutionary drone-based pest management systems developed by his interns, and a new mobile app that was helping small farmers optimize their operations. Meanwhile, back in Georgia, Alexis was hosting a group of international agricultural delegates who had come to study the Richardson Farming Corporation's innovative practices. The visitors, representing countries from Brazil to Kenya, were particularly interested in how the internship program could be adapted for their own nations. "The principles are universal," Alexis explained as they toured the training facility. "It's about creating systems that recognize and nurture talent, regardless of background. The technology and techniques can be adapted to any context." That evening, as Thomas flew home from Washington, he received an unexpected call. A major agricultural technology company wanted to partner with his internship program, offering to provide the latest equipment and software for training purposes. The CEO had been in the hearing room and had been moved by Thomas's testimony. "Mr. Richardson," the CEO said, "we've been trying to diversify our agricultural technology sector for years. Your program has created a pipeline of talent we didn't even know existed. We want to help scale it nationally." Landing at his private airstrip, Thomas found a small crowd waiting. Local farmers, both black and white, had gathered to hear about his congressional testimony. Among them was Howard Jenkins, an elderly farmer who had known Thomas's grandfather. "Your granddaddy would be proud, son," Howard said, his eyes misting over. "He always said the land doesn't know color, and neither does the sky. You've proved him right." The next morning brought another surprise. The story of his congressional testimony had gone viral, with social media buzzing about the farmer who had challenged conventional wisdom and won. Messages poured in from around the country, young people seeking advice, farmers offering support, and business leaders wanting to get involved. But Thomas knew that with greater visibility came greater responsibility. During his morning flight to check on his Tennessee operations, he drafted plans for the program's expansion. It wasn't just about flying anymore, it was about creating a comprehensive approach to agricultural education and innovation. His phone buzzed with a message from DeAndre, who was now helping implement similar programs in Mississippi. "Mr. Richardson, you won't believe this, we just got approval for our first regional training center. The local bank that used to turn us down is now our biggest supporter." Thomas smiled, remembering his own struggles with financing years ago. Change was happening, not through force or confrontation, but through success and example. The same banks that had once closed their doors were now eager to support minority farmers who showed promise. Landing in Tennessee, Thomas met with a group of young farmers who were part of the program's second phase, learning to combine traditional farming wisdom with modern aviation and technology. Their enthusiasm reminded him of his own early days, when every new skill learned felt like a victory. The key, he told them as they walked through fields of sensor-equipped crops, is to remember that every breakthrough you achieve isn't just for you. It's for everyone who comes after you, everyone who needs to see that success is possible. That afternoon, Thomas received another call from Washington. The committee had fast-tracked funding for agricultural innovation programs specifically targeted at underserved communities. His testimony had helped convince them that investing in diversity wasn't just about social justice, it was about securing America's agricultural future. As the sun set over his Tennessee fields, Thomas sat in the cockpit of his Citation, preparing for the flight home. He thought about how his journey had started with a simple desire to buy a jet for his business, and had evolved into something that was changing the face of American agriculture. His daughter's voice came over the radio, "Dad, wait till you see the latest applications for the program. We've got people from every state now, each with amazing ideas about combining farming and aviation. This is getting bigger than we ever imagined." Thomas smiled as he guided the aircraft into the darkening sky. Success was never just about individual achievement, it was about creating ripples that could become waves of change. As his jet climbed through the clouds, he knew that the Real story was just beginning, and its effects would be felt for generations to come. 1 year after his congressional testimony, Thomas Richardson Jr. stood at the podium of the newly inaugurated National Agricultural Aviation Training Center. The massive facility, built on a portion of his original Georgia farmland, represented everything he'd been working toward. Behind him, a fleet of training aircraft gleamed in the morning sun, while drone pilots practiced precision maneuvers over specially designed test fields. When we started this journey, Thomas addressed the crowd gathered for the opening ceremony, some people thought we were just talking about flying planes. But this was never just about aviation. It was about proving that talent can come from anywhere, and that success knows no boundaries. The center was a marvel of modern agricultural technology. Advanced simulators allowed students to practice crop dusting techniques in various weather conditions. A state-of-the-art drone facility taught precision farming methods. Most importantly, it provided housing for students from rural communities who otherwise couldn't afford to participate in the program. But success had brought new challenges. As Thomas walked through the facility after the ceremony, he received an urgent call from Alexis. A severe drought was threatening crops across the southeast, and several small farms in their network were at risk. "We need to act fast, Dad," Alexis explained. "These families have put everything into this year's harvest. If we don't find a solution, they could lose everything." Thomas immediately gathered his team of graduates and current students. This was exactly the kind of real-world challenge they had trained for. Within hours, they had mobilized a fleet of aircraft and drones to assess the situation and develop a response plan. DeAndre, now the center's lead flight instructor, took charge of coordinating the aerial response. "Mr. Richardson," he said, pulling up satellite imagery on the facility's main screen, "we can use the new irrigation mapping technology we developed. If we combine it with precision water delivery, we might be able to save most of the crops. The next 48 hours showcased everything the program had achieved. Teams of pilots, both traditional and drone, worked around the clock. They used thermal imaging to identify the most stressed crops, deployed precision irrigation systems, and coordinated with ground teams to maximize water efficiency. The operation caught the attention of national media. News crews arrived to document how a training program born from one man's experience with prejudice had evolved into a crucial support system for farmers across the region. But Thomas insisted that the cameras focus on his students and graduates, the new generation that was transforming agricultural aviation. During a brief break in operations, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. A senior executive from one of the world's largest agricultural technology companies had flown in to see the drought response firsthand. Mr. Richardson, the executive said, watching the coordinated dance of aircraft and drones overhead, "What you've built here goes beyond anything we imagined possible. We'd like to establish similar centers worldwide, starting with Africa and South America. Would you be interested in consulting on the project?" Thomas looked out over the fields where his grandfather had once plowed with mules. "On one condition," he replied. "These centers need to be accessible to everyone with the talent and drive to succeed, regardless of their background or resources." As the drought crisis passed, thanks to the innovative solutions deployed by the center's teams, Thomas gathered his staff for a meeting. The international expansion offer presented both opportunities and challenges. "We need to think carefully about growth," he told them. "It's not just about building facilities, it's about creating systems that truly serve communities." Alexis, who had been analyzing data from the drought response, shared some surprising findings. The farms that had participated in their program had suffered significantly less crop damage than those using traditional methods. The combination of advanced aviation techniques and community cooperation had proven remarkably effective. "This is what success looks like," Thomas said, pointing to the data. "Not just individual achievement, but lifting entire communities." That evening, as Thomas piloted his citation home from visiting affected farms, he received a call from an old friend, the same banker who had denied his first loan application years ago. The banker was retiring and wanted to establish a scholarship fund for minority students interested in agricultural aviation. "You proved me wrong, Thomas," the banker admitted. "More importantly, you showed us all a better way forward. This scholarship is my way of making amends." Landing at the center's airstrip, Thomas noticed a group of young students staying late in the drone lab. They were working on a new project, developing autonomous systems for nighttime crop monitoring. Their enthusiasm reminded him of his own late nights tinkering with crop dusting equipment years ago. "The key is to never stop innovating," he told them, stopping to review their work. "But always remember that technology is just a tool. The real power lies in how we use it to help others." The next morning brought news that would take the program in an unexpected direction. A severe hurricane was approaching the Gulf Coast, threatening not just crops but entire communities. The skills and resources developed for agricultural aviation were about to be tested in disaster response. Thomas immediately called an emergency meeting with his team. "This is bigger than farming now," he told them. "We have the aircraft, the pilots, and the technology to help. The question is, are we ready to expand our mission?" The response was unanimous. Within hours, the center's fleet was being prepared for disaster relief operations. Pilots who had trained for crop dusting were now studying emergency response protocols. Drone teams were adapting their agricultural monitoring systems for search and rescue operations. As Thomas worked with his team to coordinate with emergency management agencies, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. What had started as a response to prejudice in an aviation dealership had evolved into something that was changing lives in ways he never imagined. His phone buzzed with a message from DeAndre. "Sir, the first response teams are ready. We're going to make you proud." Thomas smiled as he replied, you already have. All of you. Now let's show the world what this program is really about. As the sun set over the training center, the sound of engines filled the air as aircraft and crews prepared for their new mission. Thomas stood on the observation deck, watching the next generation of aviation leaders take flight. They carried with them not just his dreams, but the hopes of countless others who would follow in their contrails. The hurricane that struck the Gulf Coast brought winds of over 150 miles per hour, but it also revealed the true strength of what Thomas Richardson Jr. and his team had built. As dawn broke over the devastated coastline, the distinctive sound of aircraft engines cut through the howling wind. The National Agricultural Aviation Training Center's fleet was among the first to respond. DeAndre's voice crackled over the radio from the lead aircraft. "Command, we've got visual on the affected areas. Starting our first supply drop now." Below, desperate communities looked up to see precision airdrops of essential supplies, guided by the same technology they developed for agricultural operations. Thomas coordinated operations from the emergency command center they'd established at the training facility. Around him, graduates of his program worked alongside emergency response professionals, their agricultural drone expertise proving invaluable for search and rescue operations. "These thermal imaging patterns," explained Lisa Chen, one of their top drone pilots, pointing to her screen, "they're showing us exactly where people are stranded." The same technology they'd used to monitor crop health was now helping save lives. The media descended on the center, amazed by how quickly an agricultural training program had transformed into a crucial disaster response unit. But Thomas deflected their attention to his team, particularly the young pilots and technicians who were working tirelessly around the clock. "What you're seeing," he told one reporter as they watched another relief flight take off, "is the result of investing in people who others might have overlooked. Talent doesn't care about background, it cares about opportunity." A week into the relief operations, Thomas received an unexpected visit from Admiral James Roberts of the Coast Guard. The military leader had been monitoring their operations with growing interest. "Mr. Richardson," the admiral said, watching the precise coordination between aircraft and drones, "what you've built here goes beyond agriculture. Your pilots are performing complex operations with military-grade precision. We'd like to establish a formal partnership for future disaster response." The offer was significant. It would mean expanded resources and training opportunities for his students. But Thomas had learned to think carefully about partnerships. "Admiral," he replied, "we'd be honored, but our primary mission must remain the same, providing opportunities for those who might otherwise be overlooked." The admiral smiled. "That's exactly why we want to work with you. Your program has found talent in places we never thought to look." As the relief efforts continued, Thomas noticed something remarkable happening in the communities they served. People who had lost everything were finding hope not just in the aid they received, but in the sight of young, diverse pilots flying those missions. One evening, as Thomas piloted his citation back from delivering medical supplies, he received a call from a community leader in one of the hardest-hit areas. "Mr. Richardson, my daughter watched your pilots working today. She's never seen anyone who looks like her flying planes before. She's already asking how she can join your program." These moments reminded Thomas of his own journey, of walking into that aviation dealership and facing doubt and prejudice. Now, his program was changing not just lives but perceptions across the entire region. Back at the center, Alexis had been analyzing data from the relief operations. "Dad," she said, showing him the results, "our agricultural training protocols adapted perfectly to disaster response. We're seeing efficiency rates 40% above traditional methods." The success of the hurricane response operations caught the attention of international disaster relief organizations. Requests began pouring in from around the world. Could the program's methods be adapted for global crisis response? Thomas gathered his team for a crucial meeting. "We started this program to break down barriers in agriculture and aviation," he reminded them. "Now we have a chance to do even more. But I need to know, "Are you ready for this next challenge?" The response was immediate and unanimous. The same determination that had helped them overcome prejudice in the aviation industry would now help them save lives around the world. As plans for international expansion took shape, Thomas received another meaningful visit. Richard Wellington, the aviation dealer who had initially doubted him, arrived with his granddaughter. "She wants to be a pilot," Wellington explained, watching the busy flight line. "And after seeing what you've built here, I know this is where she needs to start." The moment wasn't lost on either man, how far they'd come from that first meeting. The next phase of development began immediately. The center started adapting its curriculum to include disaster response training alongside agricultural aviation. New simulators were installed, international instructors were brought in, and the program's scope expanded far beyond its original mission. But Thomas never lost sight of the program's core purpose. During a late-night planning session, he reminded his team, "We're not just training pilots or emergency responders. We're showing the world what's possible when you give people a chance to prove themselves." DeAndre, now heading the new disaster response division, added his own perspective. "Mr. Richardson, remember when I asked you how you knew this would work? Now I understand, you didn't know. You just refused to accept that it couldn't." As the hurricane relief operations wound down, the center had a new energy. Students weren't just learning to fly or operate drones, they were preparing to be part of something bigger than themselves. The sight of their aircraft had become a symbol of hope, not just for farmers watching their crops, but for communities in crisis. One evening, as Thomas walked through the quiet hangar, he found a group of new students studying late into the night. They were from all backgrounds, rural farmers, inner-city youth, international students, all united by the same dream of making a difference through aviation. "Sir," one of them asked, "do you think we can really do all this? Agriculture, disaster relief, international operations?" Thomas smiled, remembering his own doubts and dreams. "Look around you," he said, gesturing to the fleet of aircraft and the wall of photos showing their relief operations. "Everything you see here started with people who refused to accept limitations. The only question is, how far are you willing to dream?" As he left the hangar that night, Thomas looked up at the stars, thinking about how a story that began with prejudice in an aviation dealership had transformed into a movement that was changing lives across the globe. The sound of a night training flight taking off reminded him that the journey wasn't over, it was just beginning a new chapter. 5 years after that pivotal day at Southern Aviation Dealers, Thomas Richardson Jr. stood on the observation deck of his expanded training center, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Below him, the facility had grown beyond anything he'd imagined, a sprawling campus that combined agricultural innovation, aviation excellence, and humanitarian response training. Today was graduation day for the largest class yet, but it was also something more, a moment of reflection on a journey that had transformed not just his life, but an entire industry. The sound of aircraft engines filled the morning air as students conducted their final check flights, their movements precise and confident. "Dad," Alexis called from behind him, tablet in hand, "you need to see these numbers." She showed him the latest impact report, over 1,000 graduates from 40 different countries, millions of acres of farmland served, countless lives saved through disaster response missions, and economic growth statistics that proved their program's success beyond any doubt. But it wasn't the numbers that moved Thomas most. It was the stories, like that of Maria Suarez, a former migrant worker's daughter who now managed aerial operations for a consortium of small farms in California. Or Young Ho Kim, who had adapted their agricultural drone technology to protect endangered forests in Southeast Asia. Each graduate carried forward not just technical skills, but a commitment to opening doors for others. The morning ceremony brought together faces both familiar and new. Richard Wellington, now a staunch advocate for diversity in aviation, sat beside James Parker, who had established his own scholarship fund for minority students. DeAndre, now the center's executive director of operations, stood ready to address the graduating class. As Thomas took the podium, he saw in the audience the faces of those who had doubted him years ago, now here to recruit his graduates. But more importantly, he saw the faces of young people whose dreams had found wings, quite literally, through the program. "When I walked into that aviation dealership 5 years ago," Thomas began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "I was just a farmer looking to buy a jet." But sometimes, the biggest changes in our lives come from the smallest moments of challenge. Today, I'm not here to talk about success, I'm here to talk about responsibility. He gestured to the fleet of aircraft bearing the center's logo. These planes, these drones, all this technology, they're just tools. The real power lies in the hands of those who use them. Each of you graduating today carries a responsibility not just to fly high, but to lift others as you climb. The ceremony was broadcast worldwide, watched by partner programs in Africa, Asia, and South America. Thomas's vision had spawned a global network of training centers, each adapted to local needs but united by a common purpose, breaking down barriers and creating opportunities. After the ceremony, Thomas received news that brought his journey full circle. The National Aviation Hall of Fame wanted to induct him, not just for his contributions to agricultural aviation, but for revolutionizing the industry's approach to diversity and inclusion. But the day's most meaningful moment came during the reception, when an elderly gentleman approached him. "Mr. Richardson," the man said, his voice trembling, "I was a crop duster in the 1960s. They wouldn't let me buy my own plane back then because of the color of my skin. Watching these young people today." He paused, wiping his eyes. "Thank you for finishing what we started." That evening, Thomas took one last flight in his original Citation CJ-4, the aircraft that had started it all. DeAndre accompanied him as co-pilot, a symbolic passing of the torch. As they soared over the patchwork of farms below, Thomas reflected on the changes he'd witnessed. "You know, DeAndre," he said, banking the aircraft gently, "success isn't measured by how high you fly. It's measured by how many people you bring with you on the journey." DeAndre nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Under his leadership, the center would continue to evolve, adapting to new challenges while staying true to its core mission. Back on the ground, Thomas walked through the hangars one last time before retiring for the night. The walls were lined with photos, the first class of interns, the hurricane relief missions, international program launches, and countless moments of triumph over adversity. In his office, he found Alexis reviewing plans for the center's next phase, a partnership with major universities to offer advanced degrees in agricultural aviation and humanitarian response. "Dad," she said, looking up, "remember when all this started with you just wanting to buy a jet?" Thomas smiled, picking up his grandfather's old work glove, now framed on his wall. "Your grandfather used to say that the soil doesn't care who tends it. Now we've proven that the sky doesn't either." The next morning, as a new day dawned over the center, Thomas watched a group of first-year students approaching their training aircraft. Their faces showed the same mix of determination and dreams he'd seen in his own reflection decades ago. A young student spotted him and approached nervously. "Mr. Richardson, how do you know if you're ready for all this?" Thomas placed a hand on the student's shoulder. "No one's ever completely ready," he replied. "But that's not what matters. What matters is being willing to try, to work hard, and to help others along the way." As he watched the student return to his group, Thomas thought about the legacy he was leaving behind. It wasn't just the buildings, the aircraft, or even the programs, it was the change in people's hearts and minds. The understanding that talent and determination know no boundaries, that success is sweeter when shared, and that the biggest dreams often start with the smallest moments of courage. The sound of engines roaring to life filled the morning air as another day of training began. Thomas Richardson Jr., the farmer who had dared to dream beyond the boundaries others had set, smiled as he watched the next generation take flight. His journey had begun with a simple desire to buy a jet, but it had evolved into something far more meaningful, a testament to the power of perseverance, dignity, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves a chance to soar.